Happy holidays, everyone. I'm Steven from the Hills Maniacs, and today, to continue our week of Christmas related videos, I'm going to be giving my thoughts on the most festive series on Disney Plus, The Santa Clauses. So, if you don't know what this series is about, it's basically a continuation of the Santa Claus movie trilogy that came out like years ago. It's starring Tim Allen, who eventually becomes Santa Claus. He plays Scott Calvin and ends up like accidentally becoming Santa Claus essentially. And then the second movie, he has to get a wife, which is called the Mrs. Claus. And then the third one is about Jack Frost wanting to be Santa Claus and taking it from him and everything else. And then this series takes place, I think they said like 28 or 29 years later, where Scott has been Santa for almost 30 years. And in this series, we see that Scott is starting to not really want to be Santa anymore. He wants to retire as Santa Claus so he can spend time with his family and they can be a normal, like, everyday family living in the real world and everything else. Like, he actually tries to find a suitable candidate to be the new Santa Claus. That's essentially a rundown of what the series is about, and I like that they continued it on that route where like Scott is starting to realize that like the world doesn't seem to be believing in Santa as much. You know, he's starting to lose the joy of Christmas and everything else, and he's slowly starting to lose his powers as Santa Claus. So that's kind of also what edges him on to sort of not want to be Santa anymore because he feels he's doing it wrong. You know, everybody's losing the spirit of Christmas and the holiday joy that they used to have and everything else, and he's been doing that for a long time. So I like that we get to see him all these years later. Like, now he has kids that were born in the North Pole and stuff like that that have never lived in the real world. Like, him and his wife have lived in the real world before because that's where Scott came from when he first became Santa Claus. And he married her. She was from the real world as well. She wasn't from the North Pole and all that stuff. So like they find out in this series as well that they were the first like humans to live at the North Pole, which I thought was interesting and added a new layer to like what was so special about him being Santa Claus in the first place. So I like that they followed up with this movie, and honestly, I didn't find anything wrong really with this series. There were a couple little nitpick things that I didn't really like, but overall I think it felt just like the movies. It was as funny as the movies. Maybe a little too much humor in some episodes, but like it wasn't as bad as like a lot of people are saying, like, oh, I don't like Tim Allen, I'm not going to watch this and blah blah blah. I think it's a fun, holiday related thing that if you wanted to sit down and watch something with your kids, here's a continuation of the movies that you might have watched when you were growing up, depending on how old you are and everything else. Because it was a trilogy of movies that they did with Tim Allen as Santa Claus and everything else. So you can always go back and watch those. They're all on Disney Plus. And I felt the series did really well continuing with that, with the lore behind the three movies. It didn't try to like, oh, we're going to like reboot the whole thing. Like, I appreciate that they brought back most of the actors from the original movie. There were some that were cameos, but it was still the original actors that played them. So I like that they brought back everybody from the movies and things like that, and they referenced the movies. They didn't just like try to pretend they didn't exist. It was a true follow-up to the movies, and I'm glad that they did that. And also the acting was really good as well. Like, it didn't seem like they were just coming out here like, oh, we're being forced to be in this series even though we haven't played these characters in however long now and blah blah blah. Like, they're just doing it for the money. They felt like they truly got into their characters again, especially Tim Allen playing Santa Claus and all that stuff. It just felt like exactly like a continuation of the movies, which is what it was meant to be. That's one of the things I liked the most about it, was it didn't try to steer away from the movies or be a reboot or anything like that. It just continued off of those movies. Now, yeah, there was a lot of years between the movies, and I'm glad they did that because Tim Allen is a lot older than he was in those movies and everything, so I'm glad they didn't try to like de-age him and make it seem like this is like a year after the third movie or whatever, or in between the second and third movie or something. It was a true continuation, like almost 30 years later. So I'm glad they didn't do anything like that. And also I like that it really brought back all that nostalgia of those movies, because I was a fan of I mean, I've seen all three of those movies. I kind of like the first one the best, I guess, just because it's like a funny holiday movie that you can go back and watch anytime you want, really, and it'll never. It stands the test of time as a good Christmas movie, just like Elf or um, A Christmas Story and all that kind of stuff. It's one of those kind of movies. I don't necessarily feel like it needed sequels, but we got those sequels, and all three of them feel like it. It's just this fun thing to go and watch for the holidays when you can't think of anything else to watch, or you've already seen A Christmas Story for the 100,000th time or whatever. It's something fun to go back and watch those movies. And this series brought back that nostalgia of getting to watch those movies again and picked up right where it left off, essentially. Nothing felt off, nothing felt like it was, oh, we're trying too hard or whatever. Now I'll get into some of the things I didn't like, really, is that it kind of started off slow a little bit. It was only 6 episodes, so it's not like it was too overwhelming, like, oh, we gotta waste 4 episodes. Like, if this had been like 9 episodes or something, they would have had to waste like 3 or 4 episodes, I feel like, because that's what a lot of the problems with a lot of these Disney Plus series have been with like Marvel and Star Wars and all that. With them being like 9 episodes, there's a lot to they have to try and progress forward, but also they have to waste some time because they can't come up with enough plot to fill all those episodes in. So some episodes have to drag or whatever, or feel like a waste of time. And I'm glad this one was only limited to like these 6 episodes and stuff, because it felt like it was a little slow at first, but then it picks up in the last like 4 episodes or something. So really, there were 4 good episodes, and the first 2 were kind of like getting you to that point. So it wasn't anything too bad there. I just feel like maybe they could have done a little bit more, but I think they did a good job explaining, what Scott is going through in those first 2 episodes where he doesn't want to be Santa and he's losing his powers and everything else. And then that's basically how the first episode goes. And then the second episode was him explaining to his family and all the elves and stuff that he wants to retire. And then from there it picks up with the story of him trying to get a new Santa and all that kind of stuff. So it didn't really waste any time or feel like a waste of time, but it did, like, if you like it to get right to the point, then it was maybe a little slow in the first 2 episodes and mostly just, I mean, it's not like it's an action series or something, so there's not going to be action in all the episodes. That's not what this is meant to be. It's meant to be a lot of talking and hilarious things going on and everything else. So maybe just like a little nitpick is that the first 2 episodes were kind of like, I wouldn't say unnecessary. I just feel like maybe they were a little slow. They could have been maybe a little bit faster paced, or had something else going on other than just kind of what happened in those first 2 episodes. But it wasn't anything major that really pulled me out of it. Now, something that kind of annoyed me through the whole series was that Mrs. Claus was basically complaining through the whole series that she keeps getting overlooked and underappreciated. Like, no, she doesn't remember her name from before. Nobody knows who she was before she was Mrs. Claus, and she brings that up in like every episode to Scott and stuff like that. And it kind of happens throughout every episode, like somebody does ignore her or says something or whatever. And I just felt that was kind of annoying that they kept bringing that up, like, oh, she's just a nobody because she's not Santa Claus, so she's not important, and that's kind of how people felt about the second movie, when it kind of forced her to marry Scott so that he could continue to be Santa Claus. I've heard a lot of people complain about that movie for doing that, and this kind of was a reference to that, but I felt like they did it too much. They kind of like drug that on through the whole series. And it kind of got annoying, and like they're trying to throw it in your face, like she knows that she's being overlooked. Like, I get it, after the first time she said it, where she feels like, nobody appreciates her, or they don't remember who she was before she became Mrs. Claus, and she's just a nobody, and blah, blah, blah. Like, it was fine when they first referenced it, but it was referenced in, like, every episode, and that was kind of annoying to me. But again, it didn't really, like, take me out of the series. It wasn't like it was every 5 minutes she was doing it. It was just every episode, almost. She makes some kind of comment where, like, she was overlooked or whatever, and it kind of got annoying and a little on the nose. Like, they were just throwing it out there, like, so that that this is how she feels. It's like, we got the point. Now move on from that. That was the only really, like, annoying thing about the series. But like I said, it didn't really, like, take me out of it or nothing. It wasn't that funny either. I feel like they could have done away with it, honestly. Like, we didn't need to have a reference to that, but even having that one reference at first would have been enough. Like, they could have moved on from it. Some of my favorite moments from the series, I think, were the moments where Scott and his family are trying to adjust to living their normal lives, because I think it's around episode 4 where Scott hands over the mantle of Santa Claus to this other candidate that he chooses, who's like I guess technically the other main character of the series. It's this businessman who basically by the end of the series ends up turning the North Pole into a place that like has drones and everything else, and they can make quick deliveries. He wants to make Christmas every day instead of just once a year, so he's like trying to make money from it and stuff like that. But we don't find that out until as the series progresses on, that he starts to become the villain. But after Scott hands off the mantle of Santa Claus to this guy, he and his family go off to live normal lives on Earth just as normal humans and stuff. And it was funny to see the whole 4th episode essentially was them trying to adjust to these new lives that they have, because they're so used to living at the North Pole and the ways the North Pole operates, like having elves do things for them and having the magic and all that stuff. So they have to adapt to this new environment. It made for a lot of funny moments where like they're talking about things from the North Pole and everybody thinks they're crazy, or the way they eat things, or they don't know how to order things at restaurants, because even Scott Calvin and his wife, who have been in the real world before they went to the North Pole, they just don't remember how to do all that, because it's been 30 years that they've been living on the North Pole, and the world has kind of changed around them while they've been living on the North Pole, so they're not used to essentially the new way the world works. And it made for a lot of like really funny moments, honestly. And then also when Bernard took Scott through time sort of to visit the previous Santas in episode 5, so that Scott could learn what it means to be Santa Claus and why he was chosen to be Santa Claus essentially. I thought that was really cool to see. Like, he goes through time to see all these different people who have been Santa Claus, and he finds out that they were all just created, whereas Scott was the first actual human to become Santa Claus. So I thought that was kind of a big moment for Scott to learn that, like, there is something special about him, and he's not really the reason that Christmas was losing its spirit and stuff, and it was just like, he's not the problem, really. Like, he was feeling like he was kind of letting everybody down and all this other stuff earlier in the series. So I like how they kind of did this. They had these different looking Santa Clauses. There was even a Krampus in there, old Saint Nick, the very first Santa Claus and stuff like that. It kind of reminded me of A Christmas Carol, which I guess is what they were going for, like the ghost of Christmas past and present and all that stuff. But Scott called it A Trip Through the Yoleverse, which was kind of like the multiverse, I guess, but he kept referencing or calling it that, even though Bernard told him not to. And it was nice to see Bernard again, who was like the lead elf from the movies and stuff, although he's a lot older in this series as well, because he says the reason for that, even though elves don't age, is because he gave up being an elf and went and got married to a human woman. So that kind of explains, like, they didn't have to try and de-age him either. They just had him age up naturally because he gave it up. So I like that they didn't try to, like, oh, he's just pretend he's not old or whatever, because the actor aged just like all of them did over the years, since the movie was here. But so it was nice to see Bernard again, and this kind of was a cool moment to see how they brought in all these different Santa Clauses and showed Scott, or kind of taught Scott a lesson. And then by episode 6, he decides he has to go back to save Christmas at the North Pole and everything else. So I like that they spent that whole episode taking a trip through the Yoleverse, essentially. That was a lot of fun to see as well. Honestly, if I were to rank this with the 3 movies that have been before it, I would put this, like, honestly, second. I'd say, like, the first movie, and then this, and then the second, or the Santa Claus 2, and then the Santa Claus 3. Just because the Santa Claus 2, I felt like it was almost unnecessary, essentially, or the way that they did, like, they had him get a Mrs. Claus was kind of stupid in a way. And like I said earlier, a lot of people have complained about it. I feel like if they had done it a different way, it might have made more sense. But that movie was still funny. The third movie, however, I felt like it wasn't as long as it could have been. Like, we didn't really get to see Jack Frost as Santa Claus and what kind of effect that has on the rest of the world, because he turns the North Pole into like a tourist attraction essentially, and all that kind of stuff. It lets people from the outside world come into the North Pole and buy things and everything else. And we didn't get to see it that long, like before Scott took Santa Claus back essentially and saved Christmas, you know. So like I didn't really like, that's why I put that one so low. So where this series would go, I just felt it was better than the second and third movie, honestly. And you could have maybe even just not had the third movie at all and just went right to this series from the second movie, and I don't think it would have really hurt anything, honestly, because the third movie was kind of the same plot as this, where like Scott was kind of doubting whether or not he wants to be Santa anymore, and that was kind of the whole thing. What happens if he hands it off to somebody else? Well, that person, you know, was Jack Frost, and he kind of ruined Christmas with it. So like Scott took Santa Claus back. It was almost the same plot as this one, you know. So like I feel like they could have not had the third movie at all. But let me know what you guys think. If you've seen the Santa Clauses series, let me know what you thought of it down in the comments section. And also, which of the three movies was your favorite, and where would you rank this in comparison to the movies as well? Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more. We got a whole bunch of Christmas-related videos coming up the rest of this week, so keep an eye out for those. Thank you for watching the video, everyone, and we'll see you in the next one.